Hi. Thank you so much to everyone who has shared their story so far. My heart is heavy, and perhaps you would all like to join me just in an exhale. Thank you all for having the courage to share your hurt and trauma and pain and the remembrance of those you have lost, and the stories of where you have succeeded forward. I am someone who has the opposite side of the story as part of my story. That from the time I was 15 until the time I was about 20, I was part of the violent white supremacy movement in America. I've been out now for over 25 years. And, especially watching from America over the past 6 or 7 years, watching once again this slow build up and rise of all of the things that we said that we would never forget. That the world seems to like to say the words never again, but we are often very unwilling to do the work that it requires to ensure that never again are people targeted specifically and purposefully for who they are, for what they believe, for the regions that they come from, or for who their ancestors happen to be. I've had a lot of questions over this last week and inquiries from people asking what they do. How do they have loved ones that they're concerned about that are immersed inside these the belief systems of the people that we saw storm the U.S. Capitol this past week, and how do we reach them, and what do they do? Part of the work that I do is reaching out and mentoring people who are leaving hate and violence-based movements, and help them to rebuild their lives. Through mentoring them, just sharing the things that I have learned from my own journey, and offer them the support that they need to begin to heal, so that they can understand how they got to this place of hate and violence in the first place, and begin the process of getting to genuine amends making. That for me, and this was something one of the other speakers touched on with one of the stories that she told about the man who had murdered her son. That I had a story of growing up in a household where there was a lot of emotional violence and huge amounts of dysfunction. My family would uproot and move halfway across the country when I was 11 years old. And the sense that I had from when I was very little of being the black sheep and not really belonging in my family when we moved, expanded out into the greater world. That I didn't dress like everyone else. I didn't have the same hair. I felt very much like an outsider. When I was 14, just about to turn 15, I ended up going to a party where I was sexually assaulted by 2 men. And I was left without any adults that I could trust in my life at that point, and took that trauma completely unprocessed and just like shoved it down where, and we know that unprocessed trauma doesn't dissipate, it festers. And in my case, it festered mostly into this rage, deep self-loathing and deep self-hatred that I felt that manifested mostly as rage, that I didn't understand and didn't have the tools or skills to process. In the periphery of my world, I was a part of like the punk subculture. That on the periphery of that were the white power skinheads. And I think the rage within me really resonated with the rage that they displayed. And I started spending more and more time with them. And what I began to do, which I didn't recognize at the time, and we know from research as well that people today fail to recognize, that I was building an echo chamber, that I was beginning to only consume the music and reading and materials that were part and parcel with this ideology and this movement, and that I was surrounding myself only with like-minded people, so that everything that I consumed from, movies and TV shows, books, anything, I consumed through this worldview that I was immersing myself in, and normalized it through only having contact with other people in this movement. That I became detached from outward empathy, and that all of my empathy seemed to have turned inwards in this self-protective measure, focused completely inward on myself and my perceived in-group, which included the people immediately around me, and by extension, sort of like the white race. In retrospect, I've often wondered what happened to my empathy. When I was a young girl, I was incredibly empathetic, and I was actually a very ardent opponent to apartheid and other societal grievances that I saw. And now, since I left the movement, again, I'm a very empathetic person. So understanding that I had turned all of my empathy inward seemed to matter to me, because I wondered, I had Black friends growing up, I had Jewish friends growing up. How did I disconnect from those people that I knew to attach myself to the ideas of hurt and pain and dehumanization, and just the ideas of hate? How was I able to disconnect from that? And that that there was, part of this process of radicalizing into these ideas is that I dehumanized them so much that I didn't even connect what I was doing and saying to having actual impact and hurt and harm to individual other human beings and communities, that it became simply sort of a set of ideas, that I felt so deeply disempowered in my life and so separated from power that there was a huge seduction to the feeling of empowerment, of at least being able to make people afraid of me. I would end up at one point not really having a place to live, and I was very luckily taken in by a mom and her 3 younger sons, in which my echo chamber that I was living in began to be broken. And I was in this place where I didn't need to espouse any ideology. I didn't need to do anything to earn belonging. I didn't need to do anything. They just accepted me for no reason, and began to fill my life with, regular people things, like playing Frisbee in the backyard, going fishing and camping and stuff. And I began to have these experiences outside of this immensely violent and hateful world that I had lived in. And it was within that environment that I began to have the stability, and having some of the broken and twisted need set that I had begin to be met more effectively, that allowed me to be able to have the space to shift and begin to examine what my life had become. And that would begin the process for me of leaving that movement. My life would continue to be a mess even after I had, after I had left that ideology aside. And for about the next 3 years, just my interpersonal relationships and stuff like that were still just an absolute disaster. It would take me another several years to even frame what happened to me when I was 14 years old as rape. That for almost 10 years, it was simply the story that I told myself was that I had lost my virginity to 2 men at a party when I was 14 years old. My oldest son was born when I was 23, and I was met with a challenge at that point of, how do I cultivate human beings who will thrive and who will never look to hate or violence as a viable option in their own lives. I didn't want to parent my children how I had been parented, and that I never wanted them to be like me. so over the last 23 years that my life has been immersed in that, and by extension, many people have reached out to me asking for help with their loved ones, with themselves as they leave, and so I know some of the commonalities there of the grievances and the hurts and the pains that almost no one's life. I have never heard a story that begins, so everything was totally awesome in my life, and then I became immersed in hate and violence-based movements and worldviews and ideologies. No story has ever begun that way. That it's almost always filled with other hurts and pains and anguishes. And so for me, I feel like it's irresponsible and harmful for us to ask the targets and victims of that hate and that vileness to extend the necessary empathy and compassion and outreach to pull people back from the edges of the most violent parts of our existence, and also simply just from the pervasive white supremacy that is part and parcel of America. And so for me, I feel a deep responsibility to be someone who is positioned to do that work, to offer the conditions necessary to help pull people back. I've thought a lot over this last week about, there's lots of questions like, how do we move forward? Lots of calls for unity. And I think many of you can resonate with the fact that it's like we cannot have unity without accountability, that restorative justice requires a restorative path, but it also requires justice, that there has to be accountability and hearing and centering the voices and experiences of those most hurt and harmed by extreme right-wing and violence and white supremacist violence in particular, and what the necessary conditions are for them individually and as communities to allow for a path forward. And that we often conflate the idea that, not having boundaries is actually something that is not compassionate, that we have to impose boundaries about what is and isn't acceptable, what we do and do not allow, the things that we require in order for people to come, have their pathway back. Without holding people accountable, we can't actually offer people a pathway back, and if we don't do that, we can never find a holistic way forward. In order. And I was touched by something else too about this idea of the definition of forgiveness, because for me, I don't seek forgiveness at this point. For I am immersed in the work of trying to make meaningful amends, and that it's up to other people. If they choose to forgive me for my past, then that is fine. If they choose not to, that is also fine. That is the work, and that is for them to do, and that that is not mine to seek from someone. But I've thought a lot myself about forgiveness, about self-forgiveness, about what that entails, about forgiveness towards the people in my life who harmed me, and how it doesn't mean that I forget. But it does, and I think about the words of like Brian Stevenson, and that our humanity is connected through our brokenness. And that we all have stories of the worst things that we've ever done and the worst things that were done to us. Now, some people like me have categorically worse things that we've done in our lives. But that forgiveness entails understanding that there is a story behind how the people got to where they were. The people who have harmed us, who have hurt us, who have left a legacy of pain for us, also almost definitely have their own legacy of pain, which got them to that point. Which doesn't excuse the behavior and doesn't mean that we have to in any way minimize the hurt or harm or, catastrophic nature of the things that they've done to us. It just means that we allow ourselves to see their humanity, and that we do not become those who dehumanize other in order to deal with our own pain. And thank you so much for including me in this incredible group of people who I am just so deeply moved and inspired by. And thank each and every one of you for your work. And I hope so much that we can all build a much better and different tomorrow for us and for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you so much.